Welcome to the Orphic Astrology channel. My name is Natalia Alas, and I am a sound and visual artist, somatic body worker, spirit worker, death worker, and as a professional astromancer, one of my passions is unpacking world events through an astrological lens. So for the last 2 months, I've been inviting friends who have their natal moon in the sign of the lunation to join me in breaking it down. And today we have a very special guest from Liverpool to discuss the Gemini full moon. Kiara Mohamed Amin is a storyteller, somatic teacher, and astrologer, weaving lived experience with healing and embodiment. They move through the world as a queer, Black, disabled, trans being, shaping spaces where oppression and liberation meet in the body. One of Kiara's purposes in this life is to remind us of our personal and collective liberation from oppressive systems. We are not free until we're all free. Most of Kiara's identity is changing, as what most people are also experiencing around the world. Kiara says they cannot find ways to define themselves from what they used to do, as for the last few years, they stopped all their practices to pay full attention to healing from cancer and now supporting their child who has anorexia. As of now, Kiara says they are no one. They remind us that identities are characters we get to play and put down. What matters most now is the feel of warmth in Kiara's body, the smell of homemade mocha, the smile of her children, and the purring of their cats, Jasper and Nene. Kiara was born with the new moon in Gemini, and they are one of my favorite Geminis. We met through a group art show we were both a part of a few years ago and have been talking about the stars, cosmic journeying, and our transformative life experiences ever since. So welcome, Kiara, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be with you. I wanted to ask you, since identities are changing and shifting, and the world around us is changing, shifting, crumbling. So who are you right now? And what's changing?
We were starting to touch upon this before we decided to record, because we always have these really in-depth conversations and you always bring in this beautiful way of discussing topics that we kind of take for granted. And I've been thinking a lot about that. It's actually something that I think a lot about because I feel my identity has shifted so many times throughout the course of my life. And I have undergone so many outward and inner transformations, and I've always expressed these transformations through embodiment in some way, whether it was through shaving my hair or doing different looks, and then, it just really got me thinking a lot about when, especially like, say on social media, for example, there's a lot of like branding and you have to like brand yourself and stick to that brand, right? There's like this brand formula. And I think a lot about how it's always been really hard to brandify or make myself into a brand because of that shifting or that shape shifting identity. And I feel because who I came to understand my core self to be was beyond description, right? And I've gone through a lot of these transformations, and I think the one that we've talked a lot about as our role as parents, for example, and shape shifting into that role of a parent and seemed like, wow, okay, sometimes people's identities are so solidified. And I often wonder, like, what would it be like if something shifted in them? What if they lost like um their job, which is like something that maybe they identify with so strongly. And I feel that this is something that we kind of share in common, where just the non-attachment, right, around identity and being able to be fluid around that, I think. So who am I now? It's just I feel like I am embodying more of my role as a guardian of my children, and also as a diviner, as a somatic body worker too, because I have close to 16 years of like body work experience, massage, as a massage therapist. And um yeah, and it's interesting because for me, these transitions, they're not like an overnight process, right? Like
You know,
they take a long time. And so I've been feeling how the transitioning of that is like really this deliberate and gradual morphing. Do you want to speak on who you are?
yeah,
I read the bio that you wrote, and perhaps you would like to add on to that as a Gemini, the double Gemini, right? Is that
yeah.
quadruple? Is that a quadruple Gemini?
Double Gemini. I don't know. I just feel like I can't be sure of who I am the older I get.
Yeah.
Um, the people who are so rigidly fixed in who they are, it's a false sense of who they are, because as consciousness embodies, we are meant to evolve. Our
Yeah.
consciousness evolves and grows and breaks down and collapses. It needs to collapse. Everybody should be experiencing existential breakdown in
Mhm.
order for um, the next version of them to emerge. And I think that because of branding and um, having to put ourselves out as a certain type of person, we have to be really sure of who we are. I think it's society is actually saying we can't be so sure of who we are, because what we think is so sure is old patterns, old history that we're repeating, old
Mhm.
ideas, and we're unconscious to them. And I think the truest truth of who we are is constantly emerging, and this Gemini full moon really highlights that. And I hope that through this conversation um, between you and I and the audience, we get to start really uncovering not just world events, but who we are in these world events.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So this full moon in Gemini takes place at 11:14 p.m. Universal Time on December 4th, or 12:14 a.m. in Central European Time / West Africa Time on December 5th in my location. And the full moon peaks at 13 degrees tropical Gemini, conjunct the fixed star Aldebaran in the fourth lunar station. Luna is separating from an opposition to Venus and applying to oppose Mars in Sagittarius. Both Venus and Mars are now under the beams of the sun, and the moon is also applying a square to Saturn and Neptune in Pisces and is at the bendings, squaring the lunar nodes. The ruler of this lunation is Mercury in Scorpio at 22 degrees. Mercury is rising as a morning star here and is gaining speed and strength, approaching their greatest elongation on December 7th and maximum brightness on the 10th, but is in aversion to the full moon and unable to supply Luna with much support. Mercury is also applying to Saturn in Pisces, however, and Jupiter in Cancer for another iteration of the grand water trine that's been outpouring since late October. And in this relationship, Saturn is translating the light between Mercury and the moon, further implying an element of corruption or impediments, as Saturn is tied to these themes. The full moon is taking place in the fourth lunar station, which correlates to Rohini Nakshatra, the sidereal manzil of Aldebaran, and the Chinese lunar lodge Bishu. The boundaries for this lunar station are approximately 3 degrees to 17 degrees tropical Gemini. And the host star for these three mansions is Aldebaran, Alpha Tauri, located at 10 degrees 7 arc minutes tropical Gemini, or 15 degrees sidereal Taurus. In the Indic tradition, Rohini translates to the red one, referring to the star Alpha Tauri. The symbolic image for this nakshatra is an ox cart or chariot, which represents material progress, and it is also symbolized by the red deer. Rohini's regent is Prajapati, the creator god Brahma, who represents higher consciousness. And Rohini is ruled by Chandra, the moon, and is considered to be the favorite wife of Chandra, and therefore the favorite nakshatra for the moon, alluding to the moon's exaltation in sidereal Taurus. The nakshatra is named for its anchor star, Aldebaran, which is called Rohini in the Vedic cosmology, and is also known as the star of ascent, because Rohini elevates its natives to positions of power and confers a sensual, passionate nature, which may lead to an overly materialistic hunger. But when well balanced, Rohini finds spirituality grounded in the material or earthly realm. And it is considered to be a stable nakshatra, favorable for coronations, expiatory ceremonies, planting and sowing, building of towns, and matters of a permanent nature when containing the moon. And Rohini's motivation is moksha, or liberation, and its Shakti is the power of growth. In the Perso-Arabic tradition, the manzil Aldebaran is also named for Alpha Tauri and translates to the follower, since it follows the Pleiades, or Altureia, which was considered to commence the lunar mansion calendar. Picatrix says the image of Aldebaran is an armed man riding a war horse, holding a snake in his right hand. So due to the martial nature of Alpha Tauri, the manzil Aldebaran was seen to signify enmity, struggle, conflict, and chaos. And strength is said to manifest here in the act of restraining one's violence. So this manzil was also associated with victory in lawsuits and the overcoming of obstacles. Elections for this manzil were therefore cast for, quote, destruction and hindrance of buildings, fountains, wells, gold mines, and the flight of creeping things, and for begetting discord, end quote. So when the moon is transiting here, it is admonished to pursue business and travel, marry, and to take medicine. But Al-Buni, however, admonishes to beware of beginning new endeavors and to not fashion talismans or crafts for this manzil. Instead, it was seen as suitable for burying the dead, burying treasures, and hiding secrets. Al-Buni advised against making talismans of this manzil, but those who did talismanic workings with this manzil made them for obtaining hostility and for asking for things pertaining to hatred, separation, and evil purposes. So it was kind of utilized in baneful magic. One of the manzils that is worked with for more baneful talismanic workings. And it's important to note that the Manzil talismans are not to be confused for talismans of the star Aldebaran, because the stars of or the talismanic workings of the star Aldebaran were prescribed for accruing wealth and good fortune and victory in lawsuits. And so those who practice talismanic magic know that when ensouling or embodying the talisman or the materia, there's a specific process, and so it's calling upon specific stellar spirits, and this depending on what you're calling down. So this is like a real important difference to make note of between the Manzil versus the actual star of the Manzil. So the Picatrix names the angelic being presiding here to be Azares, and Agrippa names them Azrael. So fumigations of pomegranate or frankincense are considered appropriate. In the Chinese Lunar Lodge calendar, Bi Shu translates as the net, and the symbol for this lodge is a net. Its planetary lord is the moon. The lodge is seen as the asterism consisting of the Hyades and Aldebaran, and is named after Epsilon Tauri Bishu Yi, which translates to the first star of Net. The stars of the Pleiades and Hyades were seen as the mesh of a hunting net, so this lunar lodge was tied to hunting and favorably accumulating resources because of that. And Bishu is the fifth lunar lodge in the White Tiger of the West quadrant, and is associated with the crow, which represents filial piety. And it is considered an auspicious lodge, especially plentiful around agricultural endeavors and resource accumulation. The full moon is also taking place in the second decan of Gemini, whose planetary lord is Mars. The martial influence here was traditionally associated with the power to create and to destroy. And the Picatrix described this decan to be a face of oppression, evils, and subtlety. Agrippa described it as signifying infamous and dishonest activities such as jesters and tricksters, labors, and laborious searches. But please note that the Picatrix and Agrippa references pertain to the decanic talismanic prescriptions and are not intended to be read as a native psychological profile. These are strictly for astrological magical prescriptions. Austin Coppock calls this decan the hermaphrodite, alluding to the pull and play of dualities here, where the bane and the profane reconcile. And this is a place that reminds us that two things can be true at the same time, not one or the other, but a secret third thing. It can also represent the confusion that arises when we are unable to reconcile duality and its contradictions. And Gemini 2 corresponds to the Nine of Swords in the Minor Arcana. Its ruler Mars corresponds to the Tower, and the Lovers to the sign of Gemini. The Nine of Swords shows up as a reflection of this despair of being unable to reconcile duality and the inability to distinguish between right and wrong, perhaps, or it can signify stress, anxiety, regret, or those things which lead us to stay up all night with our thoughts and cause insomnia, right? The image of the Nine of Swords is this figure, kind of with his face sunken in, and then there's these swords on the wall representing this accumulation of incessant thought. And in relation to the Tower and the Lovers, it can be seen as the fall from Eden, as T. Susan Chang talks about in her book 36 Secrets. And the Nine of Swords can imply there has been cruel or unkind behavior toward others or ourselves that has been internalized. and the regret as such past actions or the fear of future consequences. Either way, it presents a dilemma. And at its best, Gemini 2 can show up as agility and a harmonization of the spectrum of possibilities within the vast realm of duality. So the full moon is also in the bounds of Venus, which is lending some grace here. Balance described Venus's bound in Gemini as, quote, blossoming, artistic, addicted to plays and mimes, poetic, a contest winner, popular, cheerful, and prolific, end quote. And the Dodecatemoria, or the 12th part of the moon, lands in Scorpio, reiterating topics that were seeded at the start of this lunar cycle with the new moon in Scorpio, just as the Dodecatemoria of the dark moon in Scorpio was in Libra, tying to the new moon in Libra to that lunation. For those who may be unfamiliar with the Dodecatemoria, basically each sign is further subdivided into 12 parts, and each is 2.5 degrees, and each begins with the first 2.5 degrees in the same sign. So the 12th part of Gemini will be, the 12th part of Gemini 1 degree would be Gemini, for example. The 12th part of Gemini 4 degrees would then be Cancer, and so forth. So the 12 parts provide us with greater nuance around the topics of any given placement or configuration that it can indicate. And they're incorporated, especially in deciphering solar revolutions and in natal chart readings, really across the tradition, but are generally a more advanced or intermediate technique taught to students and initiates of astrology. This is really quite an interesting lunation. So with Gemini being ruled by Mercury, and Mercury's one of Mercury's significations is children, that kind of came up around the topic of world events with what's happening around Palestine and Sudan. And it was really interesting to look at Sudan's chart of like the Declaration of Independence. You noticed how there's a comet, right, that's come from like another part of the galaxy, and it's gonna reach Perigee, or the closest point to the Earth, like around the new moon in Sagittarius, and that coincides with like the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of Sudan on December 19th.
Yeah. Although this is really for the next lunation, the reason why we're mentioning here is because genocide should be spoken about all the time, but what's significant about this full moon in Gemini is the call to what are we doing about the vulnerable? What are we doing about the majority of children who are in war zones, struggling to survive, but also the significations of the comet just being on the arriving at the same time as the declaration is important in that we're going to see hopefully an emerging rush to breakdown. Like it's already happening, but it's more of the rest of the world really waking up in the West. And also there is either information overload or information desensitization that we're feeling stressed, our nervous systems are not okay, and yet people aren't linking that to perhaps it's because there's multiple polycrisis happening, and our nervous system's responding to that. Most people on social media, I'm not on social media anymore, but the last time I was, everyone's saying how tired they were and how exhausted they were and how um, run down they were. And I think that's an indicament of the fact that our bodies are saying we need to get back in touch with our nervous system, which is what Gemini Full Moon is highlighting again, but also the information that we're taking in about polycrisis,
Yeah.
crises that are happening. What are we what are we doing with that? Are we just taking it in and moving on? And then also there are people fighting for freedom um, and I wonder if the comet would create some sort of not create, but it's a signification of some sort of further catalysmic breakdown in negotiations or um,
Or like
hmm,
just the whole government structure. Yeah.
yes,
Because
yeah,
comets are,
exactly.
yeah, yeah, because comets are so often associated with kind of cataclysmic events, and it being connected to the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence for Sudan is really striking because they've been in this ongoing genocide under the guise of a civil war conflict. And so there's, these parties that are wanting to gain control and overthrow the previous constitution, right? And so perhaps this will portend um, the emergence of a new regime, and
Yeah.
we can pray that it would be a more democratic one. But there's just so much involvement from these kind of like imperialistic governments, like the UAE and US and Israel are also tied to all of that, with AFRICOM from the US. And we know that um, the Zionist entity also has like connections to all these kind of destabilization projects on the continent of Africa. But and I really find it important what you said about bringing awareness to these polycrises. Multiple crises event happening, and we have lived and come up in a society that has normalized crisis, right? um, we call it developmental trauma, and we call it, intergenerational trauma. And I think our generations in particular, or our generation, has been very actively engaged in trying to unpack that and address it and confront it, And what I've also noticed too, and that's something that has come up in my own processing of like just astrological culture, we could say. Oftentimes we see astrologers talking about like the alchemical way to work with like, transits and everything, but it's getting ignored. Like, well, what is causing this anxiety? What is causing these internalized conflicts, and they are connected to these world events. And that's where it becomes important to name what is happening so that we can acknowledge it and recognize that, yeah, this is actually affecting me. There's people that will say, okay, we'll just log off. And that's just kind of turning another blind eye to the situation. But if you're a sensitive person, even logging off is not going to do it, right? You're still going to be picking up like on the collective anxiety or the collective hive mind, And yeah, I think it's really fascinating because we are living at a time where there is information overload, which it's interesting, the Gemini Sagittarius axis can represent this. They're both signs that are seeking knowledge in their own way, and they're both capable of holding multiple thoughts and contradicting thoughts at the same time, and Gemini is really powerful um, at dissecting knowledge and information and gathering from multiple sources and being able to like understand the perspectives from like multiple angles. And Sagittarius then kind of transmutes that information and sees, well, how can this serve the greater picture? How can this serve our collective growth, right? And it's always striving for this like greater consciousness, like an evolution of consciousness. So it's really interesting with the full moon here. It's like conjunct Aldebaran, which is this really powerful star. It's one of the Behenian fixed stars that was tied to wealth and even victory. The 12th part, I think, is really interesting around these themes that we were unpacking too, because it's ruled by Mercury and Scorpio, which it can't see because the signs Scorpio and Gemini are in aversion, but there is a translation of their light happening through Saturn. And like I was saying, like Saturn kind of adds this element of corruption. So there's some sort of like corruption or possibly delay around their communication, right? And so it's possible that those themes of like the 12th part of Scorpio, which I think is tied to these ongoing topics that have been unleashed or revealed in the last few weeks, around like the Epstein emails, and then the U.S. Congress voting to release the files, and then the president signing a bill to, yes, we're going to release it. But what I noted too was that when they finally voted on that, both Mercury and Mars had gone under the beams. So there's some sort of like secretive affairs going on around these files where they're very much likely redacting them and then just crossing out a lot of like damning information that could put a lot of people at risk for scrutiny in the public eye, and they could go to jail and lose their jobs for doing all these illegal and evil things, and I think this is where those significations that we see in the tradition tied to like evil and oppression, you know they're really about the mundane level, and so they're saying like, well, how do we work with this energy? Okay, you can make talismans or amulets that would work to this effect, and they're not necessarily describing on a psychological level, and I think that's like the common thing in modern astrology, or at least like modern interpretations, isn't that, but it's really connecting these like mundane events and those crises that you were touching upon, you know.
Absolutely. And as we're mapping out what astrology is telling us in the mundane world, it's actually just bringing us back to the question of what kind of person are we, um, uh, just as a one individual, but as part of the human collective, and what kind of people do we strive to be, which is what and that's why I love that the moon is near Aldebaran. It's because we're really needing to be woken up, not just by what we know, but letting go of what we think we know. There is something about, oh, this is brilliant. Thank you, Hermes. There is something about knowledge that gives us a sense of power, and yet we don't take knowledge seriously enough. For example, the as of this morning, the death toll officially for Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, they say that it has surpassed 70,000, but and Israel keeps attacking despite the truce. But really, as I was reading that, I just thought to myself, there is so much information and knowledge about what's happening in the world, and yet it's not really hitting our bodies, because if it was, we would find it really hard to go to work. We would be actually be invited into the Aldebaran experience of seeing, are we the kind of people that do good and bring goodness through our actions and victory to those who are vulnerable. Um,
Yeah.
and the reason why it's so important that we begin this with the genocides, it's because this is mass of bodies of children and different, mostly children actually, which is quite disturbing. And I was going to say different people dying, but wherever we're looking at war, the ones who are left behind are usually children. And so we know immediately the death toll is not the correct number. And yet, what do we do with this information whilst we are, as a global community, taking that in?
Mhm.
And so I'm really feeling um, the full moon asking us, what are we, how are we metabolizing information, critical information about what is happening around the world? Are we just taking it in and then moving on and putting it down and getting on with our day? Or are we allowing um, these innocent deaths to like strike at our heart and our core and really remind us that um, we have a responsibility and a duty to each other, that we can try to escape, but we're not going to be escaping it, because structurally governments are breaking down in America, in UK, across Europe. Fascism is rising, and it's so good that we're talking about the polarity between ideology and belief, and it's not the same. And
Mhm.
also the colonial way of taking in information as power, but not letting it combust in our bodies to mobilize us to be caretakers of one another.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think also this decan that the full moon is taking place is also tied to liberation. It's about reconciling these opposites, and it is processing information. It's information that can't be ignored. It's information that it's often overlooked, but through the lens of Gemini, it's like, okay, now we're looking at the details, the ugly details even, you know? And yeah, it's beyond words what's happening in Palestine, because like you were saying, that number that the health ministry has calculated is what they've been able to document, and there's thousands more that are missing, um, and even more that are wounded. And there was another agency that had estimated that the numbers are way past 100,000, perhaps even over 300,000, right? It's a
Mhm.
massive death toll that is really hard to like wrap our heads around, because like to know death and atrocity at that level is really it's a psychic wound, you know. And I, both of us, you and I, have, we are survivors of war and genocide. We are descendants of genocide survivors, and we both grew up in war torn places. And so I think these events are hard to ignore for people like us. So this number is like really unfathomable, you know. We can't grasp what that means, because each person is beyond a number, you know. Each person that has been slaughtered was an entire cosmos, right? And so it's really the psychic wound that is being waged against the collective, you know, like the idea of like this tribalist narrative, you know, like trying to establish an ethno state, you know, for one group of people because of another Holocaust, and meanwhile there's like a Holocaust going on. It's just like there's so many layers of like and I think for those of us who have been studying and are aware of the history, you know, it's just mind blowing, the level that it's reached. And the same with like Sudan, you know, we don't see as much information about Sudan because, you know, we see a lot from Palestine because people have been broadcasting their own genocide, you know, through like the technology of smartphones and everything. And then, you know, in Sudan, not everybody has that privilege of having a smartphone that they can use to document their own genocide. Yeah, it's just it is a level of awareness that can be really overwhelming for people, and that's the main reason why people don't address it. We have to name it, you know, and it's oppression in all these many variant forms.
I think this is a good full moon to talk about astrological community. As astrologers, we are relaying the information, but we're not linking the concepts to what's happening to then what is it calling for us to do as active participants on this tiny earth. It's actually not very big. um, and also this full moon is really calling to truth, and truth is so relative. The only truth that is not relative is that we are deeply, deeply interlinked to one another and to the planet. And everything else comes and goes, and the truth takes its shape of the vessel that it's in. But our connectedness is always there, whether we are conscious to it or not. And as astrologers, what we share about each lunation, it's not enough to just share it. It's about and I know this is probably because we're both somatic body workers, and it's important that the the body is involved in the knowledge that it's integrating, because that knowledge then becomes gnosis, and gnosis is knowledge that is not held in the mind, but expressed through embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, again, liberation is calling us to acquire the knowledge, but then what becomes of that? And
Yeah,
as an astrological community, I feel like we're also being called to really call each other out or call each other in. I think that's a better way. We're calling each other in because everything is changing, including the community that we're in.
through both of our experiences where we've participated in community that, like you say, calls in, you know, a situation or uh, an important or even aberrating event, you know, to kind of bring in balance and structure in justice or harmony. You know, there's a process of engagement, right? And so I think this sort of topic, I think, is really important within like our most direct community spaces, right? Because I've seen people who get on their high horse, you know, and you are definitely not one of these people, but we have seen this happen where, you know, people start to act superior to others in their morality, for example, and then try to cancel others. And so when that gets called out, for like because it's very hypocritical by nature. And if they get called out or called in, they feel they're being canceled as well because they have this pattern of canceling others. So I think that in itself is a very touchy subject, right? And I don't feel that it's my job or my purpose to even do that, but I understand what you're saying around just recognizing where people stand. And I think a lot of times astrologers can be very opaque about where they stand. Like I like to know where someone stands politically and even in their own ideology, their worldview. Because when we're talking about astrology, we're talking a form of, it's a divinatory science, you know, and we're dealing with something that is very sacred. And if we're engaging or allowing for an astrologer who is, say, pro fascism, but doesn't express it, that indirectly influences our practice, our approach to the world, and our approach to the cosmos. And so, yeah, for me, I find myself responding to this kind of opaqueness or the lack of transparency around where people stand as, okay, well, I feel like I can't fully support that account no matter how famous they are or how popular they are. I really appreciate when people take a stand. And it's not to say that, oh, everybody needs to be an activist or everybody needs to like talk about these topics all the time, because that's not possible either. And I try to provide a balance around that because, in my own processing of crises, there's a healthy balance that I have to maintain. It's like, can address it without um, being overwhelmed by it. And so, but I have my own experience and way of approaching these things that's based on decades of experience around that. And it's just one of those things. We're getting into this like very like profound philosophical conversation because of Sagittarius and Gemini activating that. Yeah, I think it's very, very important. I think, and that, the full moon, I think, is going to bring a lot of these conversations, at least to those who are within a similar wavelength. Um, like we were talking about how just liberation politics and liberation ideology and liberation movements, for example, because we're looking at like the Aries ingress chart for the Scorpio new moon, and then the Gemini full moon, which is the culmination of the Scorpio new moon. It's really interesting to see the connections and the activations with the Aries ingress. And the Aries ingress chart was traditionally cast for the capital of the hegemony. So in the medieval era, it would have been Baghdad, right? And then because this was a technique that was established by the Persian astrologers. And then so we cast the chart for Washington, D.C., because that's arguably the capital of the hegemonic empire. And when we talk about world events, which, we're actively doing research on this, and we're going to cast a chart also for Beijing, for example, because that's another major power, world power. And it's really interesting to see the points being activated with like transiting Venus in this full moon on top of the moon for the Aries ingress chart. And the full moon itself is conjunct the Aries ingress Jupiter, because Jupiter was in Gemini during the Aries ingress for 2025. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating to look at the lunations in this way, because the lunation is dealing with the transit of the moon, and the moon is representing the people, the masses, the collective consciousness. It's not just our body, it's our collective body, and it's not just our emotions, but our collective emotional process, right? And I think that often gets overlooked. And one thing I've noticed through the series of lunations that happened earlier in the year where they were besieged, there were all these events that triggered these collective uprisings because people were literally being besieged and attacked by the state, so it caused a lot of like protests to literally coincide with it within the days or on the day of those lunations. And so I found it really interesting to begin to analyze the full and the new moons in this respect, because they are marking our collective evolution. If we want to look at it as like an evolutionary transit, as a way to um, work with alchemically, and in a way to transform ourselves, we have to understand that we are transforming within this greater body. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the table in our conversation as well.
This would be perfect to go into the Aries Ingress chart, and then
Yeah,
through that Venus moon to start uh dissecting the uh what's his name? That guy, Epstein.
Epstein.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to pull it up in the screen share, or is it on the
Uh,
document?
it's on here. I'm just pulling up my notes on Epstein. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Oh, perhaps the bit where you were saying Mercury and Scorpio is tied to espionage. What should we begin with? The talk about the Aries Ingress chart, and then link it to Epstein, or
Yeah. So Gemini ruling networks and social networks, connections between people. You were pointing out the web, like the internet, is also very Gemini coded. And other themes, other topics were, tied to like the tradition around scholars and interpreters, people who have an aptitude for commerce, and those versed in business, those who receive trust and are wealthy, like trust, like inheritances, and which is interesting in regards to the figure of Jeffrey Epstein and all that's been coming about, because that 12th part of the moon in Scorpio, pointing um, to Mercury in Scorpio, and how during this retrograde, it started off in Sagittarius, and when Mercury conjoined Mars, when that happened is when we had the release or the surfacing of the Epstein emails, which confirmed a lot of things that people have been speculating over the years. There were things or people in those emails that had already been exposed within the last few years, but were now being brought to the surface among a greater number of people. Um, and yeah, what's interesting is with that lunation, the new moon in Scorpio was at 28 degrees, which is the degree of the midhaven for the Aries ingress. And the black moon Lilith, or the apogee of the moon, is at 28 degrees during the full moon in Gemini, 28 degrees Scorpio. So it's conjunct the midhaven. And, this is also tied to these kind of uncomfortable realities, right? Lilith being the one who was shunned and demonized. And so that's kind of bringing this attention to the midhaven, the public image of the hegemony. And Venus, transiting Venus, is at 5 degrees Sagittarius, and it's conjunct the moon in the Aries ingress chart at 6 degrees Sagittarius. The full moon itself is at 13 degrees Gemini, and the Jupiter in the Aries ingress was at 14 Gemini. And so this is also highlighting spiritual leaders, teachers, even the law, these themes that are tied to Jupiter, and the revelation around these sectors of our society that have been exposed for being fraudulent and possibly putting them into exile, right? Or into the realm of being canceled, you know?
Mm.
Um,
Yes, exactly. Um, the the web of connections between people, as well as the thread of information, and who associates with whom, and the movement of body from one place to another. These are all Gemini significations. And actually, Epstein's whole, just Epstein's whole story, who he is and who he has been interacting with, which are people of power, whether spiritual or governmental or illegal, and also the fact that he had so many passports,
mm,
um,
yeah,
that was found in his safe. And as you were saying earlier, the Mercury in Scorpio is tied to espionage and highlighting Epstein's involvement with Mossad or being an asset to the Israeli intelligence. And yesterday, as I was preparing for this recording, I was listening to a podcast talk about how he literally would have more than one passport, his American passport, more than one copy, but he would report that, oh, this one's missing, or I need to get another one because I've got to have a visa for Saudi Arabia and they hold my passport. But then after that, I've got to go to Israel and I don't want Israel to see that I've been somewhere else. So
mm,
he when he was applying for passports, he would write, and I saw pictures of these his actual passport application, and he's someone who's applied for many, many passports, and at one point, just his American passport, he had several on the go, and that's not normal. And so
yeah.
even sorry, go on.
No, no, no. I'm just agreeing with you.
Yeah, so even just uh him being able to be given so much power to move around the world in between borders,
Yeah,
actually hopefully would reveal that maybe he was a sleeper agent. Maybe that's what we're going to find out about him in the future. One of
yeah.
my um one of the things that really stuck out to me about the email files was Deepak Chopra being with him being a spiritual public spiritual figure interacting with Epstein after his conviction. Um,
Right. After being labeled and convicted of as a sexual offender.
exactly. Um, And also, it's just asking in where does power and spirituality meet? And also just who knows what? We can't really trust spiritual people because they are secretly meeting and interacting with sex offenders. And also
Mm, yeah.
I don't mean to jump around, but it's it's the Gemini thing, that
Yeah.
Venus the Venus at 5 degrees Sagittarius conjunct the Aries ingress moon. Um, to me, that's really important because Venus in Sagittarius lights up media narratives, cultural production, cross-border conversations, and with it conjunct the ingress moon, it's activating sudden flare-ups around um, cultural controversies,
Yeah.
debate over censorship versus free speech, and also global conversation about representation and justice. Um, and also just I feel like it's the cultural equivalent of truth arrow being fired. So
Mm.
I'm really hoping that the information on um, the emails finally come out. The Epstein Files, flight logs, correspondence, sealed testimonies, they're all Gemini coded, and
Yeah.
they are archives of communication, movement, and networks. And so the questions that these emails are bringing up, and especially tied in with Chopra, is why do we put gurus on pedestals when behind closed doors they are um, quite close to convicted sex offenders? And why do we assume spiritual language and spiritual bodies are have ethical purity? And earlier on, you were saying how Saturn in Pisces is speaking to corruption, and that trining Jupiter in Cancer is it's really just bringing like what happens when when corruption and shadow is finally just the thread is being pulled up, and why do spiritual leaders orbit elite spaces? That question I feel like is so pertinent in this full moon because of conviction, beliefs, and networks. And what does it mean when wellness and wealth intercedes and intersects, and also um, whose best interest is really at play here? And what we're really seeing is it's the best interest of the structures that um, that keep everyday people um, compliant. That's what's really um, getting nourished by the grand trine, which is ironic to say that something so benevolent such as a water grand trine feeding into the rot. I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
It's interesting too because the full moon in Gemini is highlighting Epstein's sixth house, sixth whole sign house. And the sixth house was tied to one's slaves, and this is bringing up his life as a sex trafficker. He enslaved these children, and that Venus, transiting Venus at 5 degrees Sagittarius, conjunct the Aries ingress moon. Like you were saying, it's kind of it's lifting up the survivors' voices. Even, I really see the survivors becoming even more emboldened. And they're putting themselves into the spotlight, which brings a lot of risk. A number of them have already been assassinated and killed off, or they try to silence them. And so, Sagittarius is a very bold sign. It represents major risk taking, and that's also coming up in Epstein's 12th whole sign house, which is interesting to think about around, these women exposing their hidden enemies. These enemies have been hidden for so long, and they are, tied to Epstein in that way, and this whole vast network, um, and the fact that Gemini also deals with scholars. Both Sagittarius and Gemini are on this scholarly axis, and Deepak, Jupiter rules gurus, spiritual teachers, spiritual figures, scholars, and I think Noam Chomsky also is a Sagittarius sun, and so that's also interesting to think about because Gemini is also highlighting scholars and Chomsky as a linguistic professor and someone who I think has also been put on a pedestal by a lot of leftists. They a lot of people were expressing complete disappointment, whereas this thing came out about Chomsky 2 years ago, and people were starting to interview him and ask him why did you interact with him? Because like Deepak, he started to actually interact with Epstein more after he was already a convicted sex offender. And what I thought was interesting about that, because Epstein was very methodical and calculated, and he was working as an agent for Israeli intelligence, and he was tied to US intelligence. They were doing all these kind of behind the scenes networking between, people of power, but he drew in people that were not just political figures and prominent in these international governments, because it's not just the United States. This is uncovering the UK, Europe, many places. And it also was trying to blackmail, the honey trap scheme that they're setting up here. They're trying to blackmail critics of Israel, because Chomsky, we know, is one of the major critics of the Zionist entity, and he's given countless lectures and he's educated people about what Israel's role is politically, why is the US in alliance with the state of Israel. And he's exposed the United States as the hegemony, and he's unpacked all of these kind of political the political underbelly of oppression. So now all of a sudden he's coming into question for having these conversations. But yeah, where's the integrity? And I think that's something that Sagittarius and Gemini really grapple with, but I think especially, Sagittarius, the sun is in tropical Sagittarius and the full moon is reflecting that light. So this lunation is dealing with the energy of the sign of Gemini, translating the light of the sun in tropical Sagittarius. So it's really trying to process this level of integrity. Where is people's integrity? So all these people in these positions of power, whether it's political or spiritual, they're really coming into question. And we can expect that more things are going to be illuminated by this full moon. It's this culmination, these greater revelations. Mercury is gaining strength here, and then that trine, the groundwater trine, is really fascinating because we've seen these different iterations and configurations of the groundwater trine since October. And initially, the groundwater trine was formed by the two malefics, Saturn and Mars, in relationship to Jupiter, exalted in Cancer. And that was very noticeable around these water wars and kind of the issues around AI and the data centers contaminating countless communities. And I think also, Saturn in Pisces is associated with like the corruption of waters, right? And so bringing in Mars and Scorpio at that time, conjunct Mercury and Scorpio, and then, facing or connecting with Jupiter, there are all these traditional significations tied to these trines that weren't necessarily favorable. We like to focus on the trine aspect as like a beneficial aspect, and it's benign. It's, the nature of Jupiter. And the reality is that it's facilitating these planetary interactions. It's facilitating their agendas to be expressed and delivered, right? And so when the malefics are involved, it's bringing in these elements that are not going to be necessarily positive, you know. And then we had the Grand Water Trine evolve, where it was broken off temporarily, and then there was the trine between Saturn and Jupiter. And this can be associated with fraudulent leaders, coming to light and everything. And then Mercury joined in again, and the Sun in Scorpio joined in again, and it was reactivated. And then we had Venus join in. So then we had the two benefics trining Saturn. And so that was this kind of this confrontation by women and the marginalized, those who have been marginalized. And what's interesting about the whole Epstein case is that some people are connecting it with Saturn conjunct Neptune, but it's really tied to Venus and Venus's transit. Because Venus, so this actually started to really blow up when Venus was still in Libra, and she conjoined the fixed star Spica, which is the alpha star of the Virgo constellation. Virgo is traditionally tied to Demeter or Demeter, and Spica was seen as Persephone. And so one thing that I noticed is Spica can represent these figures that have been abducted and trafficked, right? And so I talked about this back in October around how it will be interesting to see revelations come up with once Spica begins to heliacally rise. There's some that have connected the revelations around Epstein and his network and these honey trap schemes to Saturn conjunct Neptune. And I feel that can represent another layer to it, such as this bubble, this spiritual bubble that's been building with Neptune and Pisces. And so Saturn conjunct Neptune, is bursting that delusionary spiritual psychosis that Neptune and Pisces has kind of like developed. But I have really come to see these revelations around the gross and really disgusting patriarchal underbelly of the greater political world. These people that are in power and they're ruling our lives and they're ruining everybody's lives. It's tied to Venus's transit. And I've been talking about this since October, when, Libra was still in, or Venus was still in Libra, and with the new moon taking place in Libra and with Venus so close by, but also nearing the end of this morning star phase of Venus's cycle, and then seeing that Spica, the fixed star of the Virgo constellation, Virgo being a sign or the constellation that was identified with Demeter among other goddesses, but these were all goddesses of justice, and bringing balance and harmony to chaos. And Spica was the star that was associated with Persephone, and what was what I felt was being communicated by that, because Spica was then going to make her heliacal rise. And so it's this connection to Persephone and what she represents, and one of her significations is the innocent. And so this includes children, because she was, considered a child when she was abducted by Hades. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there's esoteric levels to that. So we're not necessarily going to unpack that completely here philosophically or esoterically, but rather what it was representing to me was topics around trafficking and abduction, and these themes being brought to light when Spica became visible again. And sure enough, that's what happens. And then when Venus conjoined Spica at the end of October, we saw all these headlines in the days leading up to it, really, but really peaking around that time, where Epstein's his financial network with Wall Street moguls, came to the surface. And there's actually these
Oh,
banks.
that's a good signification for that Venus moon as well. Uh,
Yeah,
Aries ingress, financial matters coming up. Uh,
yeah, exactly, exactly. So, Venus's transit has been really reflecting this unfoldment and like this.
Maybe this could be, you can cut this out or you can keep it, but maybe this would be a good topic to do separately on Venus's transit to do with the Epstein files. Because what's really, really cool about Spica is that um, to Ptolemy, he was like that, he said that that was the nature of Venus and Mars, and that's really, and the fact that Venus was there at the new moon is just delicious. I feel like also Alvidas saying that it is of the nature of Venus, Jupiter, and Mercury. And amongst other things, it speaks of unscrupulousness, injustice to innocence, and unfruitfulness. So
Yes,
I just think all of that is really delicious that it was all there together.
exactly, exactly. So you caught my drift with that, and it's very much tied to Venus's transit. And Venus recently went under the beams of the sun in preparation to conjoin the sun or enter the heart of the sun as she transitions from morning to evening star phase. I want to do a separate video on this, and we can definitely do a video to unpack the Epstein files and the whole scandal around Epstein, because I think it really warrants a lot of research and dissection, because it's such an important thing. I've seen people kind of like brush it off, like it's like this is literally what these people in power, what ties all these people in power, and they're all corrupt, and we all know that they're corrupt, and now this is actually coming to the surface, in these intricate details and these intricate webs. Um, but yeah, with Venus now under the beams, it's really interesting because there's this mythos in the Babylonian cosmology where Inanna ascends the heavens, and she's been flying and traveling the skies for a long time. And there's a farmer who has this vast land, but he can't get anything to grow out of it. Shukuletuda, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but Shukuletuda prays and makes offerings and beseeches the gods to bring him a bountiful harvest. You know, he prays for there to be fertility in his land so that he can grow something. And all he has is one sole tree there. And Inanna has been flying through the heavens for a long time, and she's tired, she wants to rest, and she sees his soul tree in this like vast barren field. So she lands underneath and takes a nap beneath his tree. And he sees her and thinks that his prayers have been answered and Nana has arrived. But his vice emerges and he ends up undressing her without her consent. She's sleeping and he undresses her and violates her. And he flees because he knows that what he's done is wrong. And the way that this story is told in the tablets, this is an indication that, you know, in ancient Mesopotamia, there was this awareness that this is a violation. And so he flees and tells his father, like, I've done this horrible deed. What should I do? And his father tells him to go hide in the city. Because sure enough, Inanna wakes up and notices that something's amiss, like that she's been violated, like her robes have been, you know, disheveled and everything. And so she immediately starts to seek out her perpetrator, her violator. And this is really interesting in the context of what we're seeing in world events around Epstein and how that ties to these greater world events. But she basically searches him from east to west, and she can't find him because he's hidden in the city. And so she draws forth a plague. She draws forth blood in the water, in the wells, to draw him out. He still doesn't emerge. So she's getting really frustrated and she beseeches the god of the western heavens to let her enter that part of the sky, and explains what has happened and why she needs to enter the western sky so she can find this violator and bring him to justice. And so he grants her permission and she enters the western sky. Once she's in the western sky, she finds him and exacts her justice. He pleads for forgiveness, for mercy, but to her, there's no mercy for this deed, and she decapitates him and executes him. So this was seen as like a story that archaeoastronomers have deciphered to interpret the superior conjunction of Venus. So we have the inferior conjunction and the retrograde phase of Venus's cycle connected to her underworld descent. But when she is moving direct and setting from morning star to then conjoin the sun, she's invisible for like the longest stretch of her transit for like 2.5 months. She conjoins the sun and then emerges on the other side in the western sky, in the evening sky after sunset. And so archaeoastronomers have connected this story with that part of her cycle, which is really fascinating because the Babylonians interpreted this time, therefore, when Venus is like invisible and under the beams for 2.5 months, which is what she's recently undergoing. You know, she just set under the beams and on the 26th, I believe. And so when she was invisible, it was considered to be an inauspicious time for crops and agriculture because she's drawing forth these plagues and, you know, she's trying to also exact justice. And we've seen events tied to sexual misconduct or extramarital affairs when Venus is hidden. And also the last time that Venus was lying under the beams or lying hidden while she was direct and preparing to make that superior conjunction was in June of 2024. And that's actually right when Trump was convicted on like 34, 35 felony counts of fraud. And that actually occurred like right before the exact conjunction, the superior conjunction in Gemini in 2024. And then there was also Puff Daddy Sean Combs trial or he was being brought to trial around that time too. There were events tied to that. But whenever Venus goes under the beams like this is like a time where there's kind of like
Sorry to
it
interrupt. Did you say that in June 2024 was the last time Venus was, um, tell
under
me,
the beams
under the beams?
and making the superior conjunction
That's
to the
that's the last time Trump's assassination was happened. Well, hold on, let me just check it.
I think that happened right after. Yeah.
Oh, in July. It happened in July.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was convicted right around that time, right around that superior conjunction on felony
Mm.
charges. And, we've seen that he gets away with a lot of injustices. And so it's just, I think, building momentum for his inevitable downfall. You know, this lunation is also taking place in the sign of his Gemini stellium, and I think the full moon is also on top of his Uranus, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so Donald Trump has a 22-degree sun in Gemini, and his Uranus is at 17. His North Node is at 20. So the full moon is applying to his Uranus. So, it's definitely going to be connected to events in his life and to this whole scandal around that.
And also his involvement in the Epstein files as like not just files, but past involvement. Epstein spoke a lot about Donald to other people. It was seen in the emails. And so really this full moon is going to illuminate his role in that.
Transiting Mars is also going to be conjunct his natal moon, so I wonder if there will be matters around his health around this time, or that it'll activate something around his health.
Yes, every couple of months they say that there's something wrong with him and he shouldn't be working really.
Yeah. There needs to be an age limit for presidential figures, leaders.
Absolutely.
They have like the youngest limit set, but not the oldest age limit set. And that's probably the more important one.
Yeah.
Another thing that you were bringing to question was around the topic of AI and technology.
Oh yes. So I'd like to start with uh date digital ID in the UK. Um
Yeah.
so the government, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, has announced a new digital ID scheme that will be available to all UK citizens and legal residents. It will be stored on people's phones in like a government wallet app. The ID will include name, date of birth, nationality, residency, and a photo. Biometric security will be used. Um, and it will become mandatory, and it will become one of the things that you have to have as right to work, as part of your right to work checks in the UK. And the government actually frames this as partially as a crackdown on illegal working, um, and that, but there are issues about there. And also, I find it really interesting that the UK government were emphasizing on, it's going to be safe. It's building a trust framework. Um, it's got rules for how organizations can manage, share, and protect identity data. And it's like they're saying it's data minimization and user control of what is shared. But anytime when government says, "Oh yeah, it's totally safe," it's usually a red flag because they don't say how it's safe, really.
They're liars.
They're liars, and also actually from 18th November, directors and people with significant control in UK companies will need to verify their ID through the gov.uk website, which is our local government website for everything. There has been major pushbacks. There's been big protests. Um, the significant public concerns have been showing up in petitions, which millions have signed and shared. And cybersecurity experts actually were saying that they're warning that storing a lot of personal data in a centralized or mobile-based system risks it becoming a hacking target, which of course it will be. And some in the digital identity industry, they fear that the government's wallet could be undercut by the private sector identity providers. And there is a political risk. Parts of government and civil society, they warn about civil liberties, surveillance, and exclusion. But Keir Starmer has just said, really, there is, it doesn't matter. This is definitely happening. The proposal has been met with strong resistance, groups coming together, cybersecurities, and just millions of people showing up through protests. Literally, I think one was happening in September and several throughout the year. Um, and there's like an ideological clash, of course. It's not just bureaucratic reform, it's value-laden confrontation about control, freedom, privacy, and modern governance. Again, this to me shows the Aries Ingress chart moon conjunction, just people really speaking up against how we are being surveilled. Is that the right word? Surveilled? Have I just made up a word?
Yeah, no, yeah, you're right
Surveillance?
because
How we're experiencing surveillance. We're under state surveillance. We already are right now,
yeah,
and digital ID will just increase that. And it's
right,
not going to stop illegal um, working. And also, most of the illegal work in UK are work that UK citizens don't want to do. They don't want to care.
right,
They don't want to clean. They don't want to do the manual work of picking up veggies and fruits in the farms. And so the bodies and the people that are filling up those roles are people that aren't allowed to work anyway.
right. It's really messed up. And that's, I think, also pointing to the ascendant in Aquarius in the Aries Ingress chart, because Aquarius here indicates the exiled or the immigrant, right? And the othered. And so there's this, there's this agenda underneath all of this surveillance, and it's to track the othered.
So we'll see what happens in the UK in 2026 and what the rollout would look like and if there'll be more protests um, against this.
Some things you wanted to share. We were going to talk a little bit about, what we can do to work with this lunation, with the energies of this lunation, which are tied to our like nervous system. And then in the end, we'll pull a couple cards.
Yes, so Gemini affects the lungs, breath, the nervous system, um, the neural pathway, and so far in this whole episode, we've been talking about corruption and hypocrisy. And when corruption and hypocrisy is revealed around rotting structures, our bodies, often react with tight chest, shallow breathing, anxiety in the ribs, buzzing in the nervous system, a feeling of something is off, and also an anticipatory feeling of waiting for it to all crumble. And so, oh, as a way to finish this, could we just breathe in 3 times? And the audience can do that because astrology is not just about um, the relay of information of nature of time, but what our bodies are experiencing as well. And it, actually, with Gemini, it's so easy to be disassociated from the body and be completely cerebral and understand um, conceptually what is happening, but completely divorced to what's happening in the body. And so, if we, between you and I, Natalia, if we can breathe 3 times in and out. Oh, breathe in. Oh, like a 4 breath. Should we do times 4? You know, like 4 in, hold, 4 out, box breath, whatever they call it. And then um, just for a tiny moment, we just sit in silence, and then you can share with us like the medical astrology. But it's really important that we stay aware, we stay informed, but we stay present to what's hurting us, to what's moving through our nervous system, and also stay present to the restlessness that we feel and the constant avoiding of ourselves in the silence.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to say, some people might be uncomfortable with this part, so feel free to skip as well, just because sometimes people might have a hard time becoming embodied in this way, right? Or just being conscious of one's breathing. And
My suggestion would be if you find yourself being still and silent is too difficult, this would be the perfect place to literally shake your whole body wherever
yeah,
you're at. If you're driving, don't do this. Um,
yeah,
but the nervous system needs to be engaged, whether it's through conscious awareness or just shaking the body.
yes, yes, yeah. It's really
Shall we begin?
sure. Yes.
If we can breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Breathe out. 2, 3, 4. Last one. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. And out. 2, 3, 4. And you just notice the buzzing in your mind, in your body, the thoughts that could be racing or nothing at all. What's the texture of your inner world? Is it fast? Is it confused? Or is it numb? There is no texture. There's no judgment. There's just a gentle awareness to what's moving. There's nothing to do. There's nothing that needs to be done in this moment. There's just a noticing of your feel of the body against the chair, or if you're standing, your feet against the floor, or wherever they are. Notice how your body comes into contact with whatever surface that you're on. And it's okay. It's so okay. Whether you're a mess, whether you're disorganized, whether you're restless. There's so much information that we take on. And every now and then, like a plug in the bathtub, we pull that and the water runs out. And so we need to plug ourselves away from information and just be in the sensory body if we can. And then if we can shake our hands, Gemini rules the hands as well. And these are just moments of coming back. And in Gemini Full Moon, come back to your body. Liberation and oppression is experienced in the body. How much liberation do you experience in your body? What makes you feel free? And whatever that is, as long as it's not harmful to you or anyone else, engage in that sense of freedom. Learn to feel what freedom feels like in your body. The full moon is calling to freedom, to justice, and to truth. And we are bodies that interpret justice, truth, and freedom. Let us be on the side of healing and love. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Did you want to pull a card?
I am going to use the reading that I had today. I pulled Venom, and Venom tells us that something in our psyche field is corrosive. I channeled this message and I wrote it in my journal. So Venom tells you something in your psyche field is corrosive. It is a pattern, a belief, a dynamic, a conversation, a habit, or a person's words or your own that have created that. This is an instrument that it needs identification and then extraction. This isn't about blame. It's about seeing without flinching what is poisoning your vitality. The psyche resists letting go of psychic toxins because they have stories attached. It's time to name it, acknowledge it, and let the cure reveal itself. And that's venom. And I thought this was really important, personally to me, because I'm identifying what's venomous within my own psyche, through my own network connections, as well as just how I see and perceive reality. And that's really tied into the full moon.
Yeah, no, I love that card because it really reflects the Scorpio influence too of Mercury and Scorpio. Hold on.
I love it. Every time you talk about Scorpio influence, she makes a little noise. It's so cute.
I know, right? My Scorpio rising child. Oh, hold on a second. Fais doucement, fais doucement, sinon ça va décharger. So
Actually, why don't we leave her in? It's
yeah,
Gemini.
I'll see what I can leave in.
Yeah, like her voice in the background. It's okay. She's part of the Gemini full moon. They're
Yeah,
children.
we're bringing the scorpionic influence here with our Scorpio placements combined here because that Venom card is very much reflecting Scorpio's influence on this lunation with Mercury being in Scorpio, and it will actually be my third Mercury return by degree exact. So I think that's funny. And but yeah, I love that you pulled that card earlier and decided to talk about it in relation to Mercury is also being embodied here. um yeah, because of that third decan of Scorpio that Mercury will be in, and it's also 22 degrees is connected to that star of the heart of the serpents constellation, which is the serpent that is being held by the serpent bearer, uh, Ophiuchus or Ophiuchus. I don't know how to pronounce the name correctly, but it's the serpent's constellation that was tied to the serpent that taught Apollo and Asclepius the power of healing and longevity or eternal life. You know, can you hear that? But yeah, Asclepius, learned the secret to eternal life from this serpent. And so Unukalhai is the heart of the serpent. And so it's actually connected to poison and venom. And Mercury will be making this projected zodiacal conjunction to that star during this full moon. So it's very much synchronized with the full moon and what we've been talking about, and how do we transmute poison into medicine, right? It really,
Oh, that's actually also perfect because I'm the Sagittarius transiting Mars at 22 degrees is trining Chiron in Aries at 21 degrees. So the Mars is bringing up our push to examine the wounds and perhaps more of our wounds coming out, and as well as on a world stage, wounds of others, um, and the healing that comes from um, the exposure of those wounds.
yeah, 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 because Scorpio is going to uncover a lot of things. And like we were talking in the previous lunation breakdown with Devin, is, just connection between Scorpio and Sagittarius and how both signs like to uncover the truth. There might be different motivations for both, But Sagittarius, one of the traditional significations that I was looking over was being petty minded. you know, we think of Scorpio also as being vindictive and seeking vengeance, as maybe an aberration of needing justice, right? And then Sagittarius can also be a very justice seeking sign as well. It's tied to judges and all of that. And so bringing things to the surface and uncovering it and revealing and transmuting the poison into medicine.
Yeah. You asked me earlier if I have anything to plug. I don't have anything to plug actually. But I do want to remind all of us that um we all have a truth that we need to unveil within our own psyche, and it will be uncomfortable. And you will know that you're touching on a truth that you are uncomfortable to face when you look inside and immediately you want to distract yourself. Whatever that truth that each one of us has something that we're avoiding, and whatever that truth is, um, may we be courageous enough to know that it will be our medicine and that it is actually truth that is faced unflinchingly, or even as you flinch and you're uncomfortable, but a truth that is faced will liberate a part of our psyche. And that's just the full moon, really.
Yeah, yeah. I really love that you're tying that in because oftentimes truth is uncomfortable, and it's that discomfort that will liberate us in the end. Liberation is never comfortable, it's never an easy process. And those of us who have gone through transformations of any level or of any kind know just how uncomfortable it can be. And I think another thing to just remind each other that we're not doing this alone. Like, Gemini and Sagittarius remind us that we are interconnected, you know. Um, Gemini connects, you know, one-on-one or like in this network, and Sagittarius as well has this capacity to connect on the grander scheme of things. And so it's bringing the microcosm to the macrocosm. And so we're never doing these transmutations and this inner transformation alone. It can be an individual process, but it's connected to our communities and to the greater collective. Yeah. Yeah. And
Thank
if
you so much
you
for having me.
oh, thank you for joining me. I always love talking with you because we get into these really deep conversations that maybe most people don't want to get into. So I really appreciate you. And I know that the people that are on similar wavelengths are going to appreciate our conversation. And so, and that's what it's all about. It's just finding um, more of our kind and to be able to support each other, you know. Uh-oh. But basically, what I wanted to say is if you're new to my channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the like. Leave us a comment. Feel free to reflect on what we talked about and let us know your thoughts.
Please leave a comment. Please let us know in which ways truth is bursting out of you, and what truth are you avoiding, and also your thoughts on uh, what we shared on the mundane astrology. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Natalia, for inviting me to be here, and I just had so much fun.
I appreciate you so much for joining me during this time, and I look forward to working with you more on the astrology.
I think we're good together. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think we're good together.
Yeah, we have some surprises in store with our mercurial selves. We have some projects that we are working on that we will bring Kiara back and be able to connect more with your very profound insights and expansive awareness around these topics. So I'm really excited to have you join me again in the future. And thank you again for joining me for this episode and covering some heavy topics and also how to work with it. And yeah, thank you so much. I know that you were saying that there's no real way to um, connect or contact you at this time through social media or elsewhere because you're kind of going through a personal process, and so we won't be linking anything per se, but whatever we do link will be in the description box. And those of you who are new to my channel, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. And I'm running a promotion until the end of December where you can take 30% off any reading off of my website. So you'll see that in the description box below as well. And a special shout out to my subscribers and my supporters. Without your support, we wouldn't be doing this. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Ciao.
Ciao.